So, hello. Today I'd like to welcome Jorrit Tamminga, a Dutch artist who currently teaches electronic music composition at the Conservatorium van Amsterdam and sound design at HK Utrecht. So Jorrit has a wide practice which covers electronic composition, live electronics, spatialization, sound synthesis, and creative programming. Jorrit's work has been heard all over the world in a variety of venues, from concert halls to factories. He's been featured in many festivals, such as the 2007 festival Ude Muziek, where he was commissioned to write a piece for the opening, and he's also worked in music theatre. Jorrit is primarily a SuperCollider user and shares many creative coding interests with FluCoMa. He recently attended a FluCoMa workshop in Utrecht, and today, as well as learning a bit more about his practice, we shall also be hearing about his experience with the tools and how he feels they could enrich in his practice. So, Jorrit, hello, and thank you for joining me today.
Yes, thank you for inviting me.
You're quite welcome. So perhaps you could begin by talking a bit more about your practice and how you got into the world of electronic music.
Yeah, so where it all started. It started, I guess, when I was, 12 or 13, where I learned programming on a ZX Spectrum computer. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that one, but it was a very tiny computer where every key was a whole word. So with one P, you could type print, and with the F, there was the 4 words already. So you could type very quick code. And the only thing I could do with that computer was coding. And later on, I bought an Atari computer. So the famous Atari ST from the 80s, because I grew up in the 80s basically. And I used this Atari computer mainly to create a band. Actually, I was playing in a band, but these bands, they didn't like to play my music. Probably the tempo were too high or the chord changes were too weird. So I used mainly the computer to form a band basically. So I think that's where it started. So with a little bit experience with the ZX Spectrum programming, going to the Atari, making music with that, and I had only 2 discs. One was Cubase, and the other one was basic, so programming. So that I could do or making music in Cubase or programming. So that's where it started.
Yeah, so it was music making from the very beginning when you got into programming.
From the start. Yeah. And then the only possible education in Holland by then, in 1991, when I was searching for education, was music and technology in HKU in Utrecht. So that was a very logical next step.
Which is where you're teaching now.
Yes. Yeah, I stayed there in a way. Well, I went away. I went to do a master in sonology, which is not a famous institute in Holland when it comes to electronic music. And then I went back to music and technology to teach. Yes.
So I'd love to gain a bit of insight on your creative practice. So in some of our pre-interview chats, I asked if maybe there were some specific pieces that may give a good demonstration or representation of your work. And the first you mentioned was Empty Mind by Henderickx, which is for oboe and electronics, for which you made the electronics. So I watched a great video by the Antwerp Symphony Orchestra where the composer and others discuss the piece, which I'll link to below. And they describe the electronics as wanting to achieve some kind of super oboe with polyphonic capabilities. So I was wondering if you could describe the project to us, and especially how you approached working with another composer and building the electronics for the piece.
Yeah. So I have a very long collaboration with Wim Henderickx already. So this is one of the many pieces we did together. We started from scratch, literally. We started with a session with an oboe player, a microphone, a laptop, and an empty score, basically, literally an empty score. We were in a studio of Champ d'Action, which is a famous electronic ensemble from Antwerp. And Wim Henderickx mentions things like, well, I'm curious what will happen if we program a harmonizer. So I did some live coding, let's say. So I added an octave. And then I said, okay, maybe we can do a whole harmonic series on top of the oboe. So let's see what happens if we do the tuning of the oboe itself as a kind of harmonizer. So we were just improvising in a sense, where the oboe player was giving information, the composer had some ideas, and so we were feeding each other with ideas, with sketches. We had four speakers, so we could also do some very simple specialization tricks. I didn't prepare anything, so I had to type everything literally from scratch, and of course there wasn't time. Give me an hour. No, I had to do very fast, quick coding tricks in order to get a fast result. So based on this session, we went all out different ways, let's say, and halfway the conceptualization of the piece, Wim Henderickx mentions this this mega or big oboe, let's say as a tube of 10 meters or 100 meters long. So that I like that idea also, that we can take this oboe and make it very giant, very big, in a kind of physical modeling approach. So I took this idea of this harmonizer also one step further. So I thought, okay, maybe I can create a harmonizer, which is of course creating other pitches, but is also at the same time function like a kind of spectral enhancer. So on one side it was very technical, but it was a kind of technical solution to the concept Wim Henderickx gave me. So it was, he gave some concepts, I gave some concepts back, and that looping process went on until he finished a score. Then I checked out the score, obviously, and I based on this score and the modes and the rhythmic patterns and so on, I based my live electronics. I finalized my live electronics.
Yeah.
And there's one thing, sorry that I speak so much, but I want to mention one very interesting thing. It started out for a piece for oboe and 8 speakers. So oboe and live electronics. Then when Wim Henderickx heard the final result, I think we played the piece 2 or 3 times. He got a commission to write a piece for oboe, orchestra and live electronics. And what he did is he took the skeleton of the original piece and he orchestrated the live electronics. So the electronics I made, he then reorchestrated basically. So all the harmonizers, the spectral delays and so on were then put in the orchestra. So I like this idea that electronic sounds can also inspire a composer to even take it one step further. So when that piece was finished, of course I had to thin out all my electronics because some of the electronics were already taken care of by the orchestra. So that was, so that's what I wanted to mention, that there was a kind of an extra result, so the orchestra piece.
Yeah. And so you'd had this preemptive project where he kind of got an idea of the kind of different sonic textures that your electronics could produce. Yeah. And so in terms of orchestration, he had that kind of palette and he was able to kind of mix those into his orchestration, or?
Yes. Yeah, but sonically. I mean, I gave him, of course, the terminology like spectral delay, spectral harmonizer, and so on. So he could, based on that, also recognize the sonic results of my live electronics. And then he was sonically try to mimic, for instance, spectral delay, that the flute came in, then then a clarinet, then a double bass, and so on. So that instead of having one chord, that the notes come in one after the other. As a simple example.
Yeah. So was that project using SuperCollider as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting as you were describing the very beginning of that creative process, talking about live coding with the composer, because another artist on the project, Chris Kiefer, at the University of Sussex, he did a piece with Alice Eldridge, and he's a SuperCollider user, and he talking about his sessions with her. He was also talking about live coding, experimenting with things on the fly. So is SuperCollider and the kind of text-based paradigm something that lends itself particularly well to that kind of practice?
Once you get used to it, yes. I mean, for a starter, maybe not. And I'm not saying I'm the most experienced SuperCollider at the moment, but I feel kind of comfortable with it now. So when I develop my own tools at home in the studio, I also start sketching. So this sketch approach, typing one line and then execute, and it already gives a sonic result. I can use the same approach in an improvisation session with an instrumentalist. So it's not live coding as a stage performance. I mean, that also exists, obviously, but this is mainly as a tool to create fast results or to interact and immediately, let's try out, maybe I can change a pitch shift or whatever. And within SuperCollider, there are already great tools for this. I also made some tools myself for this live approach or for this improvisation approach, where I can very easily add some faders to all the parameters I want to change in real time. So the combination of the tools already available in SuperCollider and some additions of my own, it works for me as very good in an improvisation session like I described with the oboe.
Yeah. So another project you mentioned was a collaboration you did with the recorder player Erik Bosgraaf called Dialogues, where you did, again, the live electronics. So this is a fascinating project. It's a kind of revisiting of Pierre Boulez's piece that was originally for clarinet, Dialogue de l'ombre double.
Mm-hmm.
And I must say it's a beautiful record. So again, perhaps you could go over how you approached the project, how you approached working with another musician such as Erik, and how you approached a lesser known but still monumental piece by a composer like Boulez.
Yeah. So I met Erik in 2005, I think, 2006, when we were asked to do, you mentioned it earlier, to do the opening of the festival, the Old Music Festival in Utrecht. And I made a piece for him based on a Dutch composer, Jacob van Eyck. He has the same name as you, but Jacob van Eyck is an unknown composer, but he wrote thousands of improvisations and pieces for recorder in 1650, something like that. But he was also a bell player. And I'm really fascinated by bells. My father used to be a bell player. And that's also part of my DNA, basically. So I made a piece for recorder and live electronics, mimicking combining actually the sound of the recorder and bell sounds. So I tried to make convert the sound of the bell with harmonizing techniques into bell sounds. And so we already had a starting point there. We also did some other music theater pieces. And then Erik wanted to make his own version, or let's say transcription, or whatever you call it, of the Dialogue de l'ombre double. And he got official permission by Pierre Boulez. So we started recording that piece first and keep as close to the original as possible, using the instructions from the score. Very precisely. I didn't use SuperCollider there, actually. Well, yeah, I did, but only for the piano reverb. Okay, but that's a different story. So we were in the studio recording all these crazy, fast, virtuosic licks. And then we used 2 extra sessions in the same studio to record some improvisations. So we wanted to have the Boulez piece, obviously. That was the main course, so to speak. But we also wanted to put some improvisations as a kind of reaction to that. So we were in this mindset of recording Boulez. So that was probably somewhere in the back of our heads. So we wanted to do something different, way slower, way more sound-based, where the piece of Boulez is very pitch and very pitch and rhythmic based. We wanted to do something completely different. So I used patches or programs I developed in SuperCollider, which I used also in previous pieces, which I did with Erik. And we recorded like 20 or 30 improvisations. And yeah, that's usually how it goes, I think, with many other musicians as well. After the recording sessions, we digested everything. And maybe 2 or 3 months later, we decided, okay, let's use that piece. And then we thought of an order. And that's how it was. I think I did a little bit of editing here and there, but not much. So we wanted also to stay honest to the arches we built within the studio sessions that day.
Yeah. So you say you do a lot of recording and working off the recordings. Is what we hear on the record, for example, is most of the electronics going to be live electronics, or is there?
Yeah, it was all live. Yeah. So of course the burlesque piece was completely pre-recorded, obviously, but all the others, there was no. So we were sitting in the. Well, Erik was in one studio room. I was in the other room. We could see each other, obviously. But Pro Tools was running, recording a stereo track of me and the microphones of Erik, and that's it. So the editing was mainly, there were some clicks or some glitches we didn't like so much, but that was mainly it. So it's a literally live improvisation.
Yeah. Cool. Maybe we could discuss some of the FluCoMa tools specifically now.
Yeah.
So you attended a FluCoMa workshop in Utrecht recently, and I know that you've been able to have a bit of a play with them since. So you mentioned in some of our earlier talks that you'd specifically made use of the fluid.pitch or fluid.pitch, maybe, but I'm assuming fluid.pitch then.
Yes, for the live process,
yeah.
Yes.
So perhaps you could talk a bit more about that and how you.
Yeah, but that was, I needed a very good pitch follower. That was basically it. And I messed around a little bit with the built-in pitch object in SuperCollider and with the Tartini object. And I found a way for myself to fine-tune it for the purposes I needed it for oboe, for clarinet, for voice, and so on and so forth. But I missed, for instance, the yin object, which was part of, or you could download it for a maximum speed. So then fluid.pitch came out for me, and then I thought, okay, that's the one I need. Also for instance, processes like, and I hope I can remember, there's this pitch shifting technique, SOLA, pitch synchronous overlap and add pitch shift, which also needs a very good pitch follower. So whenever I do SOLA techniques for instance, for vocal processes, I need a good pitch follower. And with fluid.pitch, that works way better than with the other two. So I know this is only 1% of FluCoMa, obviously, but this is the only object I've been using for over the last year, also in shows and so on. All the other objects, and I already checked your question out. I think I can replace many of the stuff I'm doing already with KD trees and neural nets and stuff like that with the FluCoMa objects. I'm not there yet at the moment, but that will be my next step, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, because you said that you're very interested in especially parameter mapping using neural networks and machine learning like that. So I imagine that up till now you've perhaps been using something like Wackinator or... Well,
I've seen Wackinator, obviously. But I use, there's a library from Nick Collins called, what's it called again? I forgot the library, but in this library he programmed a neural net object, and the neural net for training is using an external program. So that's actually what I've been using. So I'm not because the SuperCollider is quite fast, but not so good with arrays. So with the neural net external next to it, that works good for me, at least, to train or to map my 3 or 4 faders, let's say, for a very multi-dimensional plugin, for instance.
Yeah.
So in a way, I'm using it's the same philosophy as Wackinator.
Yeah. Well, maybe we could kind of stay around that theme for a moment, because when I asked if there are any kind of recurrent themes or interests in your practice, you mentioned the mappings of few controllers to many parameters, things like that, and also preset morphing.
Yeah.
So I was wondering
Preset morphing, yes.
I was wondering if you could break that down, because I don't quite.
Yeah, preset morphing, but at the same time also sound morphing, and they, of course, they can be related. And for me, it's a little bit like the holy grail of electronic music, at least for me. And I've seen this also historically, this theme popping up every once in a while. You have sound A, you have sound B, and you go as fluid as possible from A to B. And when you have a sound or a synthesized sound or whatever, where you can control many parameters simultaneously, then with preset mapping, you can ideally go very fluidly from sound A, preset A, to preset B. And that is actually one of my main things, also musically or in live electronic processes, that I like these fluid gestures. And also, and with fluid, I mean that it's hard. Well, you don't hear weird steps, let's say. So it becomes an expression method in its own. And I'm then also, while doing this, while programming this, but while composing this morph, so to speak, I'm mainly focusing on how the shape would go. Is it linear? Is it more exponential? Is it a sinusoidal shape? Is the speed of change constant, or is there a kind of acceleration and then a kind of ritenuto towards the end, let's say? So I'm very fine-tuning all these separate parameters, how they are scaled. And for that, I'm using, of course, my ears mainly, and all sorts of mapping shapes.
Yeah, it's interesting that that you approach that from with the actual generative parameters that are creating the sounds. Because I mean, I know there's one object in the toolkit. I think it's called audio transport.
Yes.
Which does a spectral interpolation between two sounds. Yeah. Is that something that interests you?
Yes, as well. Yeah, a lot. When I was a student, so way back in the 90s, there was a programmer in my school who programmed based on the theories and the Fox 5 things from Trevor Richards. He programmed his own spectral morphing program. And it's, to my taste, still one of the best audio morphings, where you have literally sound A and sound B. You can draw a curve in between, and the sound morphs brilliantly based on spectral analysis from A to B. And unfortunately, I know this programmer very well, but he didn't have the time yet to port it to the recent OS X operating system. So it only functions on 10.4 or something. But I liked that sound a lot. And I made my own, kind of cheating object as well, which mimics the same behavior sonically. So there's sound A, and with a slider I can go to sound B, mimicking the sonic quality of that program I mentioned earlier. So with finding where are the peaks in the spectrum, and then with some frequency shifting, you get all this glissandi from sound A to B. But it's fake. I mean, it's not as brilliant as this audio transport object, but sonically, sometimes I prefer my own cheating solution, because that was based on some aesthetics, let's say, I wanted to hear in the sounds.
Yeah. Well, that's something that I'd be quite interested to hear about as well. When you're looking to develop a tool or a project, something like that. When you're kind of turning to these techniques, any kind of machine learning or descriptors or automatic slicing or creative coding in general, would you say that you turn to them in quite a functional manner? Do they empower you to bring your musical dreams to reality, or are they something that is quite creatively stimulating? Do you see them as a tool unto an end, or would you consider their configuration as a kind of fundamental part of your creative practice?
Yeah, sometimes it's a tool. Like, for instance, when I do parameter mapping or one-to-many mapping, that I only have two hands which can turn knobs, and instead of having 14 or 16 faders controlling one plugin, so then it's just handy to have this mapping ID. But what is my fascination in using programming languages and formulas and algorithms, the surprise element. So, for instance, this morphing thing, of course, it's nice that I can get this morphing as sounding nice as possible. But when I'm going from sound A to B, and sometimes I can discover something in the middle, which I couldn't have achieved, by improvising or whatever. So I like this, call it happy accidents or surprises or whatever you like to call it. That's I think my main reason to use programming.
Yeah, that's certainly something that I know in a lot of the plenaries and various meets that we've had over the 3 years as the projects. That's a theme that seems to have been quite recurrent in a lot of creative coders, talking about that surprise, being surprised, finding that thing, but also getting your system into a place where you're kind of expecting the surprises, but it's quite a delicate balance to find. I suppose one way of discussing that as well is, and sort of learning about your creative process, is when you're approaching a project or approaching a piece. Many of the people I've talked to have talked about wearing different hats, and at one point being in coding mode, at one point being in performance mode. And I was wondering, are those hat changes quite fluid for you? Do you have to be in a certain mindset to do one thing and another to do another? How do you kind of navigate that kind of landscape?
That of course it also happens to me. So when I plan my day or my week or my month or my year even, I make sure that there's time enough to experiment. So in the beginning stage of a project, whether that it's creating sound design for Wim Henderickx, for instance, or preparing a live electronic patch or a composition, there's always, the empty screen starting. And but there's also pen and paper to sketch ideas, to write down concepts and so on. So that's the sketching phase, maybe tryout phase, programming. So then it's all creative, whatever. But there comes a point where, the deadline is approaching, or you should send a demo or whatever. And then it's more about production or producing. So then all the sketches and all the sketches should be finalized or should be rock steady when it comes to a performance side. So then it's this production part can be making sure that the sounds are sounding okay, that the composition has a nice arch and a nice shape, that the live electronic patches won't fail, and so on. So then it's more production based, and that's definitely a different mindset. It is in a way more bookkeeping, let's say, and then in my agenda, or in my case, my kind of to-do list, there are check boxes then, because then I know very clearly, okay, check if this is long enough, check if this is not too loud, and so on and so on. So then it becomes very practical, and that can be 50% of the work, sometimes 20%, depending on the project. And then, of course, the third stage could be the performance side, which is then a completely different approach.
Yeah, great. One other thing that I'd like to get your input on, especially as you're a teacher yourself as well. I'm curious to know that when you, over the course of your practice, encountering all these new different sets of tools that come out that do various functions, things like that. I'm curious to know if you've ever had any particular frustrations that you often find yourself coming up against, perhaps in terms of interface or learning a new tool. And I'd like to know how you like to be introduced to a tool set, and also if it's very important to you to have a great access to the very low level workings of an algorithm, or if you prefer to take a higher, more conceptual view over the thing. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, but that's because you started with the teacher approach, but that's completely different than my own working
Indeed.
methods.
Yeah.
So what do you like to hear first?
Let's go with your approach first,
okay.
How you like to be.
Yeah. So in my case, I don't mind whether it is the tool is in C++ and I have to compile it myself, or that it has a very fancy interface. So depending from project to project, sometimes I like a DAW, like Logic, because that mixes way better than I would do my mixing in SuperCollider. And I'm not so, let's say, conservative. I'm not so strict. Let's say I only have to do it in SuperCollider. So some things, well, a lot of things I do in SuperCollider, but also other practice I do in Logic for the more mixing stage and programming synthesizers for some projects. So then I like that workflow, and for others I like the programming workflow. So in that sense, I can switch quite quickly. I believe. Of course, I tried out also other tools like Audio Sculpt, and I've been working with Ableton Live a little bit. I used to do a lot of Max MSP until 2002, I think. So that's past tense, let's say. But yeah, for instance, now this FluCoMa is maybe a good starting point. That's a new philosophy for me, in the sense that today I also spend a little bit of time to get used to the philosophy of FluCoMa in relation to SuperCollider, where all the processes are not stored in arrays but in buffers. So the more buffer approach. So I think that will take a little bit of time for me to get used to that. But yeah, I'm not sure if that's an answer to your question.
Well, it's the whole buffer paradigm, something that was widely discussed over the project. It certainly took me a bit of getting used to. I'm a Max user, but yeah. So that was perhaps one of the more frustrating parts that you found yourself coming up against when using the tools.
Yeah, well, yes, because my own paradigm would be, for now, it used to be, I used the server side in SuperCollider to create the sound design part and all the oscillators and all the envelopes and the filters and so on. And the controlling part and all the modes I'm using and all the series and numbers, I would use arrays for that on the client side. Of course, I was using buffers, but only to store FFT information and samples and so on. But hardly ever else, sometimes control voltages, control signals, but not so much actually. But when I was checking it out today again, I was thinking maybe there is a use, no, not a use, there may be a reason for it. Maybe it's more CPU friendly, maybe, to use buffers instead of arrays, because I know arrays are very slow in SuperCollider, especially large arrays. Multi-dimensional arrays are really, really slow in SuperCollider compared to programs like processing or C++ and so on. So, yeah, but I think I have to reprogram or translate some of the stuff I already did and see if in FluCoMa it works way more fluid or faster CPU wise.
Yeah. Well, sorry. Do you think then that you'll find yourself translating things from buffers into arrays to bring it into a format that you're more used to, or do you think you would assimilate the buffer?
Yeah, nice. Well, because what I was doing today, I was working with the chroma object with the recorder recording to see if I could use it, and I found myself indeed translating the buffer information into arrays and then processing them. But yeah, maybe I should find a way, and maybe there is probably, that I can stay within the server side way longer. Maybe that makes all the processes way faster and more refined, maybe. But yeah, I was used to use arrays and collections and dictionaries before this. Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Well, I know the team are working hard to make lots of sets of tutorials and stuff to kind of introduce people into the buffer paradigm and stuff. And I'm not on the programming team, but I assume that there is a reason for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, maybe now from the perspective of teaching these kinds of things to people.
Yes, that's a good, yeah. So when I started teaching, and also larger groups, for instance, music and technology, it's a pretty big school. We have 90 students a year, so total, including the master students, we have a school of 360 students. And I teach, for instance, a course in year 1, which is called sound design, and it's about sound synthesis techniques, sampling, and so on. And for the first 10 years or so of my teaching practice, I was using SuperCollider a lot to explain things, to show things. But I got a lot of critique from the students and comments, not very offending, let's say, but I got tips, let's put it that way, because most of those students, they come in with an Ableton Live background or an FL Studio background or a Cubase background. So what I slowly did is, go to their mindset. So starting with, in Ableton, Logic, showing the stock plugins. So, what's already available? What do you all have? And I mainly use open source or free plugins to start with. And then not very often, occasionally, I then still use SuperCollider to explain, this is possible in Logic, but you can also do it in this way. So that was, I needed to invest some time, for instance, to learn to work in Ableton Live. I don't use Ableton Live in my own practice, but I should be able to show them the basics of Ableton Live, for instance. So that was a tool I needed to learn from scratch. I mean, it's not so hard, but still, I wanted to be able in a lesson to be, double click and quickly start a sound or make some interesting routing and so on. On the other hand, yesterday I was teaching in Amsterdam a course, electronic music, for the bachelor students as well. But it's a smaller group. It's not 90 students, but 3 or 4 students. And there I dare to start SuperCollider from scratch. So I gave them the task, download SuperCollider on Mac and PC and Linux. And there I said, let's start, boot the server, play a sine tone. And then I built from that. and also listen a little bit what they want to achieve with it. And based on that, together we build programs from scratch. So with a smaller group, I don't mind to start on a very low level with a program like SuperCollider. But with a large group, where there's a lot of variety and level, then I think, I think I have to start with Ableton Live, let's say, as a starting point.
So that's to do mainly with the differences in levels of the students.
Yes, and the group size. And in Amsterdam, the groups are way smaller. And I know there are 2 teachers of electronic music there in their curriculum. One is more focusing on recording, mixing, mastering, and I do basically all the rest, which is still a lot, obviously. And in Utrecht, so the other school, with this with is 90 students each year, we have 40 teachers. So I only have one segment, which is sound design, and we have 4 teachers who are teaching Max MSP, SuperCollider, JavaScript, and so on. So that also is a big difference. So in Utrecht, I have to focus mainly on the sound design part, showing at first the standard sound design tools.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a concern of the FluCoMa project, as well, as I'm sure you'll be aware, having attended one of the workshops, how to kind of teach these things to different people, and also how to introduce people to paradigms within the tool set, such as the buffer paradigm, which isn't necessarily a way that people can be used to approaching the.
Yeah, but I think it also starts, at least to me, one step earlier, and that is, why would you use FluCoMa or any tool for that matter? So if you can interest or show students that, okay, with Ableton you can do this and this and this, but if you want to do this special thing, then you need extra tools in order to do so, or you want to go one step further, and so on. And I think in Utrecht, the FluCoMa course, well, you got the students who are really interested in this domain. But if I would have 90 students and then try to convince them to use FluCoMa, then I should think of a trick, let's say.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly probably the Max for Live, perhaps, is something that could bridge that gap.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. I see that happening. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know Rodrigo Constanzo has made some Max for Live modules that use some of the FluCoMa tools as well. So that's beginning to be a thing. So, yeah, that's great. Great. Well, Jorrit, thank you so much for that. I think that was a really good chat, and I think people be very interested to have learnt about your practice and to see how you're beginning to incorporate the tools into your practice. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
I'll be linking all of the various videos and pieces and people that we've talked about over the course of our conversation below this, so people will be able to access that there. So, Jorrit, thank you very much, and I shall speak to you again soon.
Yes.